as Christians in this day and age today, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here. We are revolutionaries. We are going against the tide. We are different. And I think we need to understand that there are limits to what we're about to read. I'm not saying that the Word of God is insufficient. I'm not saying that the Word of God is in error. I want to look a little bit about why this was written by Paul. He had a similar situation going on. There were different revolutionaries in the first century. They were called Messianic Jews. The Jewish people in his day and age were, in the words of one commentator, notoriously bad citizens. Now, the reason they were so bad is because there was this passage in Deuteronomy that indicated that they had to have a king that was from Israel. And they felt like it was a sin to acknowledge the kingship of someone else. We talked in the first hour about Caesar is God. They couldn't do that. That's okay. But they were not going to acknowledge the authority of the government of that time because it was not in Israel. It was not a Jewish government. And that's why Paul writes what he does. Now, we have a title up here. What does the Bible say about government? Is what we'll be talking about. This is not the title I chose. I chose the title that was our first point. We find our first point in verse 1. Government, God's idea. God instituted 3 institutions. Family first, husband and wife, gardens, Genesis, etc. Second, we see right after the flood, and by the way, I got to thinking about this. There's a period of time there was like capital punishment didn't happen. After the flood, we had where when man sheds man's blood, his blood should be shed. That's the beginning of the institution of government. Capital punishment starts it. The question I had in my mind, and you can contemplate this, Cain gets a reprieve. He's guilty of murder. Nobody else is around. I'm not sure what the forensics were back then, but he's guilty. God knows he's guilty. The Abel's blood is crying out from the ground. He's convicted by God, but he doesn't get executed. Something to contemplate. So we have the family instituted by God. We have government instituted by God. And the third institution, the church. See Acts 2. Those are the 3 institutions that God's ordained. Every person, it says in verse 1, is to be in subjection. Now, this is a fun passage because the way this reads is very, very Jewish. As a matter of fact, it's described by one commentator as being as a Hebraism. Because it really says every soul, that's the way they used to talk back then, is to be in subjection. Now, in order to understand some of the words we're about to see, I want to give you a little bit of a Greek lesson. Please do not glaze over. All right? The simple word first, the root word we want to look at is tasso. T-A-S-S-O, we might see. Tasso. This is a military term. This is a placement. This is an arrangement. This is how things happen in the military world. Tasso. And then this word is going to be combined in a few places with other prefixes and prepositions and that sort of thing to understand this word. Tasso is the root, okay? Tasso. And when it says be in subjection, we have a different military word here. It's properly pronounced hypotasso or hypotasso, hupotasso. Hupo is under, to arrange under. This is subjection is so misunderstood. I particularly think it's misunderstood by the legalist. because they're going to say the woman is supposed to be in subjection to her husband. But again, this is a military term. This is going to be a subjection that is arranged under the leadership of someone else. And by the way, this respect that we're having a discussion about here, you may find yourself, I doubt it, but you may find yourself alone in a room with Joe Biden. And you may also find yourself the smartest person in the room. But he may at that time still be president, and you still have to honor his position. You have to honor and respect the position he holds in government. So it's a subjection that's an ordering and arranging, a positioning yourself under the authority of somebody else. We have to understand that this is it's a voluntary sort of thing. We have to do this. Okay? So this is subjection here is this word here, hypotasso. And actually it's actually kind of a passive kind of verb and all that kind of thing. But hypotasso is what we've got to do, says here. And submit yourself to the governing authorities, and those are the ones that hold authority over us. For there is no authority, and by the way, the Greek word here is authority. From the Greek word authority, it is authority. Okay? And no authority exists except that which comes from God. We had a great video earlier about the crucifixion, the passion, all that sort of thing. And one of the things they did not touch on because it wasn't part of the discussion that I think we need to point out here is when Pilate and Jesus are having this exchange, Pilate kind of gets a little frustrated. And by the way, we have the same capability with the authorities these days. Pilate gets frustrated because, don't you know that I can have you put to death? And then we read in John 19:11, Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. Jesus tries to instruct Pilate, saying, even the authority you have, which you're misusing most of the time, has been given you from God. It all comes from God. And as a matter of fact, we get here, those which exist, those that have come into being, are established. And this is the third time, the second time we see tasso used. And this is anti-tasso. Oh, excuse me. My mistake. That's next verse. This is actually, I'll give you the description I read in a commentary. This is so much fun. It's so alliterating. This is a periphrastic, perfect passive indicative of tasso, stand ordained by God. And perfect tense is one of the things that's really important in Greek. In Greek, when they say something in the perfect tense, that means it happened in the past and it has continuing results. This is saying that the powers that be were established in the past and continue. And so that's why we've got this whole tetragrammaton. Again, from tasso. Arranged. It's been established and arranged in the past by God. Government. God's idea. He started it. He put it in place. He established it. Our second key point, I'm going to admit to having a little fun here. Resistance. Futile. At our car wash yesterday, I say our car wash because we're trying to raise some money for Michaela's trip. One fellow in their church came up and he drives a Nissan Cube. They've stopped making those. That's a shame. I thought it's a cute car. I saw one down in Florida that had the Borg cube on the back and said resistance is futile. When we resist, here's another tasso word. Anti-tasso. This is to arrange ourselves in array against. This is a battle term. When we resist the authority, we're arraying ourselves against the authority. But let's continue. He has opposed the ordinance of God. Look at this next word. And this is tough to pronounce, so I'm not even going to try it. But this is a word that you see in the pharmacy. Now we're moved away from tasso for just a moment, because this is the word antihistamine. Anti, against, histamine, to stand against, to stand. We talked about standing in the first hour as well. I just love how this all dovetailed together, particularly the video about the discrepancies supposed. When we are in the place of standing against the ordinance of, we stand against the ordinance of God. Resistance is futile because it's not just the physical people that you're standing against. You're standing against Yahweh God himself who put them in place. Now, let's understand. This is not saying that God is responsible for the sinfulness of man in those positions. Get that. Man is still going to be man. The lost are going to act like the lost. And this is where I'm saying we're acting as revolutionaries these days. Because there may come a time, just as Preston has predicted, and we're looking for it to happen because we can't have a prophet predict and not have it happen, because then that endangers poor Preston here. When it gets to the place where we may have to say, no, I can't do that. I can't say Caesar is gone, in effect. There may be some times we're going to have to draw a line in the sand and say, no, I can't do that. We're going to have to be ready, willing, and able. He keeps talking about exercising that muscle because we're going to have to use it eventually. God is not responsible for the sinfulness of man, but we have to, and this is really kind of just government. We do not want to oppose the just government. This word stand against, we don't want to take a stand. And by the way, this is again, it's a perpetual thing. This is talking about people who constantly are standing against the government. We have evil people in this world. We need to stand for what is right. Verse 3, fear, optional. You don't have to fear. Look at verse 3. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. When you're doing the right thing, you don't have to be afraid. Here's one of the best illustrations of that. We in our world today, living here in Highland Springs and going to the dojo out in Tuckahoe Village Shopping Center, I didn't remember the name of the place, going from one side of town to the other, we're on the interstate an awful lot. And I am one of those people that believes in driving the speed limit. Okay, with me so far? So I am on the interstate. I know, and Mr. Leadfoot doing this. And I only say that because she said, all right?
Nope, that'd be important.
Okay. Matter of fact, I was talking to somebody at the car wash yesterday, and we had a guy in this church years ago. I'm not going to mention his name because somebody watching this video may know him. But he told me one time he drives according to the speed limit. I said, oh, so you obey the speed limit? I said, no, I drive according to the speed limit. He adjusts a suggestion to the way he wants to do things.
Really, love it.
Okay, is that what? Oh, she just motioned with him. Okay.
Well, he'll say it's a suggestion.
Okay. Okay. All right.
I'm not saying anything he would not agree to.
Okay. That's very good. Got the synergy going on here. I was on the road one day between one and the other, and I happened to glance over at an on-ramp where a state trooper was just sitting. And what's the expression? Taking pictures. And when I saw it, it was like, okay, there he is. I'm doing the speed limit, so I don't have to be afraid of whether or not he's going to pull me over because I'm doing the speed limit. But I tell you what, I see people on the interstate all the time. I have been passed more times than I can count, like I'm sitting still on the interstate. If you are doing what you're supposed to do, you don't have to be afraid of encountering the law, if you will. Good behavior, useful behavior, and literally the good. It's you don't have to be, it's not a cause for fear for the good, but for evil. Literally, we talked about this before, the word harm. Do you want to have no fear of the authority? Literally in the Greek, do what is good. And you will have praise of the same. Now, that's not to say they're going to call a meeting and stand me up as being one who observes the speed limit and give me some sort of reward. That's not what we're talking about. That means I get to keep on going down the road and not get pulled over. You ever wonder, this is a side note here, do you ever wonder when you do get past like you're sitting still where the police are? It's, it's like I'm going to either see him on the side of the road or up in a tree, one of the two. You wonder where the karma is coming in. Anyway, so fear is optional. You don't have to fear government. Now, I'm going to also put in this other caveat. We have evil people, even in law enforcement, that try to use their position to abuse other people. Okay? And that is wrong. I think of in the past few years, I'll just go ahead and say it. White law enforcement people just taking an advantage of a black person beating them. Okay? That's wrong. I will be the first one to say that's wrong. That's abuse of power. That's abuse of the authority. Okay? I'm not going to endorse that. And so we have to, the nice thing about that is, and I know that sounds funny to say, is the law even can touch those evil people that are in law enforcement. Okay? Paul did that over and over again. He used the law of Rome to extend his ministry, even though he was being held without cause. His whole I appeal to Caesar sort of thing. Number 4, minister, sordid. For it, and by the way, if you read the King James, this has actually been so much fun for me. He is what's put in there in the King James. The law enforcement people, that state trooper that was on the side of the road, he is a minister, a servant. The Greek word there is where we get our English word deacon. He's a servant of God. When was the last time you addressed the policeman who pulled you over? And I've not been pulled over in a long time, as you might imagine. The one who pulled you over as a minister of God. Yeah, no, Preston is not going to be doing it. Have a little more fun with it. Hey, deacon. That'll mess him up bad. How did you know what the deacon is doing? Well, if you get the wrong officer and he's the wrong skin color, yeah, I understand. I get that, Preston. People on that are looking at the camera can't see you hiding behind all of that. Anyway, but he's still, government itself is what the Bible is saying, is a minister of God for good. If you do what is evil, be afraid. And you should be afraid. If you're doing what is wrong and you know it is wrong, you should have some fear, because when you get caught, something's going to happen. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. There's a reason the authority has been given to government to not, by the way, the sword is a symbol of, back to our beginning discussion, of capital punishment. Okay, this is talking about not only the ability to punish, we'll talk about in a little bit, but the ability to, if the severity is great enough, execute. I did some looking. Have you ever seen these statues of quote unquote justice? Okay. What do you see in the statues? Quiz time.
Yeah.
A couple scales,
Blindfolded.
blindfolded, and okay. Preston, I do love you.
But it's usually a female.
It is. I've never seen it in otherwise.
It's always a female.
It's always a female. So we've got the blindfold. Ha.
Yeah.
Okay. And we've got the scales. And what's the other thing?
Usually,
A sword. That's right. So she's got a sword as well. These three symbols, setting aside the fourth one, her hotness.
I think that's pretty important.
Okay. The sword is indicative of the right that God has instilled in justice to execute that justice. The scales are symbolic of being able to weigh the evidence and come to an appropriate decision. And the blindfold, and not all of them are blindfolded, by the way. I've seen some that are not. And in fact, somebody said South Korea had a statue that was an unblindfolded statue of justice. And they said they're the only ones. No. You can go to New York City and on the Supreme Court building there is unblindfolded. But what's the blindfold mean?
Subject.
Exactly. It is not subjective. It is objective. It is fair. It is looking at only the evidence and doesn't matter the religious background of the individual, does not matter the skin color. None of that matters because they're blindfolded. They're weighing objective. He is sworded in order to execute the power. And by the way, this verse 4 twice says a minister of God, a minister of God, a servant of God, an avenger, a punisher who brings wrath on the one, and this is so well written in the New American Standard, one who practices, and literally in the Greek, the evil. This is someone who is ongoingly practicing. This is a participle, and I won't get into that because we can talk about that enough. This is a participle saying they practice. Their lifestyle is to disobey. Their lifestyle is to be disobedient. Their lifestyle is evil. And the sword is in the hand of the minister to be able to correct that. The fifth, therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection. It's only reasonable. Not only because of the wrath, and we talked about that before in verse 4. There are people who will obey the law only because they're afraid of the consequences. But that's not what Paul's saying here. He's saying not only should you be afraid of the consequences, but for conscience sake. And by the way, this word conscience is misunderstood. What do we think of when we think of conscience? Okay, Steve, you laughed first.
Nothing yet.
Okay, we have a distracting student over there. Okay. Oh, wait, yes. Well, I'm the same way when I'm sitting there. I'm doing the same thing. I disrupt the class. I disrupt the class when Kathy's trying to teach poor Michaela over here. She asks questions, and I have a ready answer. What's that? That's right. I will join in with the most inappropriate answer. It's how many soldiers did so-and-so take? All of them. No, 300 or 600, depending on who you're talking about. So, okay, disruptive student. Conscience. We have this going on. This word is so key in our day and age because there are people who will say that this word is not true. The word is literally the conscience, number one. And number two, it is to understand together. Get that? That's the root word in the Greek is to understand together. People this day and age really do understand as a group what is right and what is wrong, what is morally acceptable and what is morally unacceptable. We've talked about this before. Ray Comfort especially does this in his videos. You know, do you think that, it's that rape is okay? Well, if that's the way they identify, if that's the way they live out their life, that's fine. Well, do you want your sister to be raped? Now, hang on a second. All of a sudden, the situation changes because they've got a sense of conscience. We have to understand that even though they might decline to acknowledge it, even though they might even deny it, bless you, conscience is still alive and well in our society today. And we want to be able to be in subjection because there are moral standards that everybody really understands. Government is God's idea. And we're entitled, I think, to make use of that for our benefit. And by the way, I'm going to probably do it more and more and more. We talked about in the first hour. I identify as vaccinated. So don't be intolerant. There are laws that protect us. There are laws that, and it seems like it's all askew. There's no question about that. Because the laws seem to be protecting the wrong groups. The 2% seem to be louder than the other 98. You understand what I'm saying? They've got organizations, a bunch of organizations, to help support their philosophy, their sin. We need to get a little bit more revolutionary in our approach to stuff, using the law for our benefit, but still abiding by the law. So this is one of the reasons that Christianity is not so well viewed these days, because and I'm the first one here. We're viewed as that out of step with society. Yep, that's me. That can be a good thing, I think. It's kind of like, you say that like it's a bad thing. Maybe out of step with society is not such a bad thing after all. But we need to be respectful of the government that God has given to us. And back to our starting video. We may have to one day, just like our forefathers did to give us the freedom we have right now, we may have to stand up for what is right, what is biblical, and sacrifice whatever it takes from the first hour in order to regain some of those freedoms that are being abridged. But let's remember that it's God's idea. The next verse in Romans 13, I'm going to identify as a transitional verse because it begins to talk about taxes. And we kind of touched a little bit on that in the video before we prayed. Taxes. We're going to talk about that next week and talk about the whole question about, is it lawful to give money to this government that we just don't agree with? That was the mentality Paul is addressing in this chapter.